So I think this morning one of you spoke about, did somebody speak about GER, not GIR? So gross intake ratio, that's another important, another indicator used by UNESCO. What we do find though, in South Africa, we don't really generally struggle or have challenges with actually getting the students into schools. But what does this look like, or what is the purpose? The purpose is to indicate general level of access to primary education. It's gross because we're not looking at the age. So we're just looking at the first year of primary school, regardless of age. And the purpose is to see access. So you see here, you've got the number of new entrants in first grade of primary school, and divided by, again, so now here, where's the first two indicators, you were relying just on population data or census data, etc., data where you are not the source. Here we are combining now. So the number of new entrants would be, the Ministry of Education would have that information, but you would need to know the population of everybody in that age group to calculate this, to have this indicator. And again, you can disaggregate by gender and location. Limitations could be, a GIR doesn't necessarily tell you anything. It could be artificially high because students going to school later than the official primary school entrance age. So gross intake or gross ratios, not necessarily so useful. We find we are more interested in the net ones. So, yes.
Sorry if I may, Olivia. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
That's fine.
Because I work a lot with some of these,
okay.
Particularly based numbers. What has happened to the South African gross intake rate? What would your guess be on that? Remember that until recently we had, sorry, Justice, you wanted to?
Yes, I think now it's stabilizing. You know, previously it used to be over 100%. I think because of, appropriate age issue where, learners, even if they are not 7 years old, are coming into the system. So currently, things are stabilizing, and we see, the learners of appropriate age being in grade 1. So I think that's my
Absolutely, because really what one had for a very long time is that grade 1 served as a type of kindergarten for a sort of place where parents could take their children while in a sense to mind their children while they're too young still. That has changed now because it's moved down to grade R level. So in grade R we probably still have a lot of children that are underage, but in grade 1 we've got far less of it than we used to have. So that will stabilize a lot. But very often people look at this at the at the enrollment rate in grade 1, and then they say 12 years later that's how many matrics we should have. But what they forget is that in grade 1 you've got people who are 2 years too young, you've got people who are 1 year too young, and you've got the grade 1s of grade 1 age. So you had too many in grade 1, and therefore many of them would only later get to matric. And for instance, that there was this committee that the minister appointed looking at school retention rates, and it started because somebody had misinterpreted those figures and thought that we are doing very badly because a lot of children are dropping out long before they reach secondary school, simply because they had misinterpreted what's going on in grade 1.
It's interesting that you mentioned that specifically South Africa, you talk about underage children, that kind of inflated the number, because in the UNESCO stats they talk a lot about overage children who waited too long to come to school, maybe in a more rural type of context. But either way, that would be over 100%. The net intake ratio, again, similar, but this one cannot be over 100% because now you're only looking at all the new entrants, and you're dividing that by, you're just looking at the new entrants who are the official primary school entrance age. So then we would only look at 6-year-olds and not the other 7-year-old, the 5-year-old entrant. Okay, and this is a more precise measure because we are seeing now, because we're specifically looking at the eligible population for primary school intake. Yes?
On this one, in our context, we have a challenge on the internet intake, because we have 3 age where a learner can be admitted in grade 1.
Okay.
Is a learner or a child who is 5, turning 6 before June. That learner can be, or that child can be admitted. A learner of 6 years old as well can be admitted, because we have already one who is turning 6 before June. And then we have the age that is in the Act, which is a child who is 7 years old. So basically we have 3 years where a child can start grade 1. So basically when you calculate this one, you always get a very low figure. Whilst, when journalists, for example, analyze the metric results or learners who wrote, or candidates who wrote national certificate, you have 430. But in 1999, you had over 1 million learners who started grade 1. Where are these learners, for example? I'm just giving an example. Usually in our context, if you use 6 years old, it's only possibly you can get around 40% of those. If you take 7 years old as well, you can get 50% of those who are in grade 1, and the rest are either in grade 2, and then you tend to leave them out. And then when you present that statistic, it is as if in South Africa most of the learners are not starting at the appropriate age when they start grade 1, whilst the others are already in grade 2. Thank you.
A very good point. How would you then adapt the net intake ratio to be suitable for South Africa? Would you then say new entrants to the first grade who are 5, 6, or 7? How would you adapt it? I mean,
Okay. Usually, we try to do something that we engage with UIS on this one and others. We use adjusted net intake rate.
Okay.
Basically, you look at all the 7 years old who are in school, regardless of the grade.
Okay.
If they are 7 years in grade 1 and grade 2, you take all of them, even if in grade 3, you take all the 7 years, so long as they're attending an educational institution, and then you divide by the total number of 7 years old. That's where you get, but so long as we always write, the notes to say, how did we arrive at this particular figure? Because if someone else does the same calculation, we will arrive at different, indicator value, and which create problems. So we always underline to say, how do we arrive at this figure? Yeah.
So it's very important that you mention that, because then if we were to do cross-country comparisons, we should use the adjusted NIR figure to compare with other countries' NIR, we would say.
Sorry.
Yes.
Having international experience, do any country where you have, the intake rate, let's say grade 7 and grade 1, and then compare it with grade 12, and then, nothing has changed in between. Do we have that perfect system?
Oh, you mean that there's no dropout?
Yeah.
Are you asking for the measurement or the actual figures?
No, I'm just saying, with the experience that we have.
No. But definitely
like
some countries have more than others, so.
Because, in South Africa, it's like, children starting at this age, they're not reaching matric. And, the question is where.
What's happening?
Yeah. And it's like, it's in South Africa only.
No, it's not only who said it's only in South Africa? The news, the media.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you get, it's like this is happening only in South Africa and not anywhere else.
No, these indicators, these indicators are talking about indicators for any country. This is just a measurement of it. So definitely, I mean, I don't know so far as if you want to add here, but there are countries a lot worse off than us, and then there are countries that are better off than us. Countries where children are, the net intake ratio is much lower, and specifically the fact that they mention here when they the problem of overage, people coming later, whereas we don't have that problem. But again, this is why indicators are so important, so that you can really see where we are doing very well, where we are doing so-so, where we need to improve. Because we do well in certain areas, I think. Prof, nothing? Okay.
No, that's fine, I think.
Okay, so they look at the first year of primary school, and then they also look at the last grade of primary school. So again, we're looking at access, but whereas the first grade of primary school was more about can you cope with the access, can we take in everybody, the last grade we're looking at how effective is the primary school, the primary education schooling. So what it's looking at is a proxy to measure primary completion, and it's looking at the impact of policies on primary education. So the current policies we have, does it translate into those first graders, those students who joined in first grade, them actually completing up until grade 7? How would we calculate it? So what we would do is we would look at the gross intake, the number of new entrants to grade 7, and we would again divide it by the population of that age group in our country to see what our gross intake ratio is in the last grade. And important, new entrants is important because we're not interested in the repeaters. We want to know only the new entrants. Limitations here, again, you're going to have overage and underage children, but again, because they entered primary school early or later. Because remember, we're comparing this indicator, we are calculating it as a percentage of the population for a specific age group. So I'm not quite sure how that's been dealt with within the South African context. Now, if we're looking at grade 7, granted that, because remember we spoke about a specific age, so do you also have an adjusted rate for this one?
Yes. Because you find that most of the 13 years old, when they started, they are already in grade 8. So that's why I said, when we were looking at the data, we found that it's either 40% of the 7 years starts grade 1, and then of the 7 years old, and the other groups you can start later. So what we do, we always look at how, so long as the child is attending a form of educational institution, that child is at school. Because if you just say, no, let me look at only those who are a particular age, so it's a problem. So we look at that, and we try to adjust.
So age issues not
But
so narrow focus.
Yes.
Okay, but again, this isn't a situation, I think the less developed countries will struggle a lot more with the intake ratios than South Africa does. I mean, our children are in school, but again, I suppose the limitation of this is this tells us nothing but quality. Okay, it tells us the children are there, doesn't tell us if they are learning at the appropriate level. For that we use, obviously, the ANA and other data like that. So survival rate, again, closely related to the intake ratios. And survival rate is what they want to predict is, they look at a specific cohort, which is a group, let's say learners who were in the first grade in 2007, will they survive up until grade 5? So that is what the survival rate is. And survival rates are important, well, for a number of reasons, but you can look at survival rates for different years or 2 different grades, and specifically the 5th grade of primary education is considered important internationally because the 5th grade is considered, or commonly considered, as a prerequisite for sustainable literacy. So if somebody's not surviving up until grade 5 at least, then we're going to have literacy issues. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on this, or has any input on this, or views. Someone specifically has worked on literacy in younger groups. Okay, so the purpose here is to measure retention capacity because we want to predict whether they will get the learning that they need to do. So what's different here compared to some of the other things we do is the method that they use. And for this method, we use a method called the reconstructed cohort method. Because what you want to know is, remember we're looking at learners who were in grade 1 in 2007. So we want to know what's going to happen and will they survive. So the ideal way to do it would be to do a cohort analysis, a real cohort analysis. But the problem with that is you would need information, you would need to follow those learners for the next successive years. And we don't have that type of information available. It's expensive to do, it can be time intensive. And so they use a method called the reconstructed cohort method. And what I'm showing you, what they then do is, instead of needing information for 5 years, they will compare enrollments and dropout and repetition rates for 2 years, between grade 1 and 2 in a specific year, grade 3 and 4 in a specific year, and then using that with the information that they get, the number, the repetition rate, the promotion rates for 2 years, they will then be, I'm not going to go into detail in this at all, but some of you, those who were more mathematically or statistically inclined, they will actually use this to predict survival rates or to calculate survival rates. So fast, I'm not sure if you just want to add something.
Perhaps let's go back one. If one sees that the promotion rate is 80.9, in other words, 19% of children have either dropped out or repeated. So in the next year, of 100 who started, 80 would be left, 81 would be left. And of that 81, 80% would complete if the same percentage applied, applied as one sees there in grade 2. So 80.1% of 80.9 would complete that. So you multiply the one by the other and you get just around 64% would therefore complete grade 2. And then of those, 79.7% would pass. So you multiply that by the 64 by 79.6% and you find that, what is it, just about 50% would pass with third grade without having dropped out or without having repeated. So assuming, in other words, that what applied between these 2 years applies for every grade right throughout that cohort's history, one can say what proportion of the cohort would reach grade 5 without repeating or without dropping out. And so it's simply that 80.9 or 0.809 times 0.801 times 0.797, etc. And at the end of that, you get your percentage. So it's relatively easy to do. All you require is 2 years of annual data. But of course that data needs to be relatively clean, and that's where our EMIS system comes into it, and the annual survey. How good is that? How good are we at getting those promoted, the repeaters and the dropouts? And particularly, how good are we with dealing with movements between schools? Because if a child is moving from one school to the other, in the one school he may be picked up as a dropout, whereas he's entering the other school and he may not have dropped out of the system. So we may get some things wrong there because we don't have enough information of flows within the system. And that's where what the SA SAMS is supposed to, and LURITs are supposed to eliminate, because we should be able to track the individual child right through. So that's the intention there. But of course we know we still have very far to go with that.
Okay. So the reason I mentioned this, and it is a bit technical, is just that it is very commonly used. It is not the ideal method, but it's what you can do given data limitations. The ideal thing would be to have information on that 2007 learner for each successive year. But we don't have that. Most countries don't have that. Or not most, but many countries don't have that. And so we can use this using the last 2 years. But like you said, there are assumptions that you are using, and these assumptions obviously have can result in limitations, in comparisons, etc. And important, what he said over here was that when you start indicating when you start measuring this at sub-national level, you have the problem of people who've transferred through schools. So it's considered a dropout by one school, but it wasn't a dropout. Maybe they just moved. And again, a limitation there, it's not telling us, it doesn't really address access issues in the sense that countries with low enrollment rates might have high survival rates, but the reason they have high survival rates is because they had low enrollment rates to start with. So yes, so you cannot look at this indicator in isolation. You need to look at it with other indicators as well. And again, earlier I said, the difference between normative and positive. I'm not saying that this is ideal, this is the right way to do it. All we're saying is this is what UNESCO uses, and this is what they're using in country comparisons. But that's why it's interesting also to bring in the AU indicators, which have been adapted to a certain degree for within the African context as well. This is a predicting. What you're predicting here is just the gross intake ratio for the last grade of primary school, whereas before we actually looked at what is the actual situation in the last grade of primary school, so I'm going to skip through that one.